This is International Master Eric Kislik, and today we're going to be talking about the Queen's Gambit Accepted. This is one of the most important openings in all of chess, especially for anybody playing d4, and we can really see some of the main ideas behind temporary pawn sacrifices by looking at how white regains the pawn. So let's get to it. d4, d5, c4, offering the gambit pawn, and here d takes c4 leads to the Queen's Gambit Accepted. Declining the pawn can either lead to, let's say, a Slav or just a normal Queen's Gambit declined. So in this position, white has many ways to try to regain that pawn on c4. So one way to do it, and which is kind of a basic point, is that if we go e3, the problem for black is that there's not an easy way to defend the c4 pawn. So for instance, if b5, that's a big mistake because of a4. Notice this is one of the key traps in this whole opening. If takes takes, don't forget that once the game starts, all of the rooks are undefended. So here, white just simply has queen f3, snagging that rook in the corner. So you have to be very, very careful about tricks like this at a very early stage. So instead of this, normally black will just play knight f6, bishop takes c4, e6, and white will just develop with knight to f3 and then castle. This is the most natural way to try to complete development. And black generally plays c5, castle, a6. And there are two main position types to aim for. So essentially there's this tension here. And there are two basic main choices. We can either take the pawn and enter an endgame, or we can allow the pawn to be captured at some point and usually play with an isolated queen pawn. So if you want to play with the IQP, one common way to play is simply to go queen to e2, moving the queen out of the way, oftentimes preparing rook to d1. This is a common plan. Sometimes the rook also comes to e1, but this is the natural idea. And then if b5, bishop to d3, if c takes d4 now, then e takes d4. And one of the only issues for white is that black is fundamentally very, very solid. All of black's pieces are pretty well placed to simply blockade the pawn. So if black puts the bishop on b7, it'll be hard for the isolated d pawn to advance. So if a4, the typical way of answering a4 in the Queen's Gambit Accepted is simply to take the pawn on a4 and to simplify the game. So after b takes a4, knight c3, castle, rook takes a4, black can just go bishop to b7. And one of the points in general in this opening in taking on b4 is that black has access to the b4 square for a piece. So in some cases that can mean knight c6, knight b4 gives black access to the b4 square with a piece. And if, for instance, if bishop g5, a common kind of idea to try to challenge the square in front of the pawn, black can just play knight bd7. So typically the isolated queen pawn positions that white can reach in the Queen's Gambit Accepted are interesting, but do not offer white any objective advantage. That being said, this is a good way to play for a win. Simply the positions are complicated and they're a bit unbalanced. I have personally played the move d takes c5, where white's basic goal is to try to have a lead in development and put pressure on black. So here I like to play the move bishop e2, and here the basic idea is that if we can go knight e5, bishop f3, we might be able to make it difficult for black to develop the queen side. Although here black has the move knight bd7 covering e5, knight bd2, and then b6. So black is just developing very, very quickly. So let's say if we try to drive away the c5 bishop from its good square with b4, the problem here is that black can just go bishop b2, castles. If knight c4, black can play the solid bishop d5 and then simply improve the worst placed piece with rook fc8. Knight e5, takes, and now black has the very useful a5, making use of the rook being on the a file and challenging the pawn here. So for instance, if white defends the pawn with b5, black can play rook c5 and has no objective problems. So Personally, I have liked to play the endgame, although once you enter the endgame, if black is able to develop the queen side solidly, then black should objectively have no problems. And additionally, the move knight f3 is very interesting too, although in recent times the move a6 has been doing very well and many grandmasters have been playing it. And basically black's idea is to try to go b5 and bishop to b7. And usually in this variation there are many exchanges on the queen side, and frequently what happens is if tons of pawns get traded off, for example, if almost all the pawns get traded off here on the queen side, usually we're going to end up in a relatively dry equal position. So one of the best ways for white to fight for the initiative in the Queen's Gambit Accepted is to play the sharp move e4. I've always found this move to be very interesting, and in playing the Queen's Gambit Accepted a bit myself with black, it's not an easy move to counter. So I'll show you one of the main plans. So there are many different ways. I've personally played the move knight c6 with black, and the idea is to just challenge the d4 pawn very quickly. So after white defends the pawn with knight to f3, black can play bishop g4, again putting more pressure on the d4 pawn. So white advances with d5, gaining some space, and after knight to e5, plays the move bishop f4 to try to challenge the knight on e5 right away. And when black retreats, white plays the move bishop e3. And part of the point here is that the bishop is going to be more active than it would be on g3 in the case of black playing e5. So after knight f6, we can simply defend our e4 pawn with knight to c3. And then after e5, I play bishop takes c4, a6. And here I have a nice little trick for white. The idea is to go h3, so I'm challenging the bishop now, and if bishop to d7, I can play the very nice h4. This is a quite nice idea over here on the king side, because notice what happens here. After bishop g4, I can play the move h5, which is actually a really beautiful move, and you'll see why in a couple of seconds. So for instance, let's say we look at knight takes. So if knight takes h5, I can play rook takes h5. And after bishop takes h5, what I've done is I've distracted the bishop from protecting the king. So let's say I play the move queen to a4 check now. So now if black goes queen to d7, I have the very strong bishop to b5. Notice I'm simply pinning here, but I'm also exploiting the fact that the rook is undefended. So after a takes b5, I have queen takes check. And after queen d8, I have queen takes b7, and here more pawns are falling, and white has a big advantage. So this is a very nice, kind of beautiful and deep trick for white. So the knight c6 line doesn't quite give black full equality. One of the other main ideas is what happens after e4 if black tries to challenge this pawn, the pawn on e4. So in the previous line, we looked at one idea where black tries to attack the d4 pawn. That was this idea with knight c6. There's also knight f6 attacking the e4 pawn. And there's also c5, again attacking d4. Another idea is b5 defending. And another idea is e5, again attacking the d4 pawn. So all of the sensible ideas for black are directly doing something with a very clear and straightforward goal. So if knight f6 attacking e4, we can play e5, knight d5, bishop takes c4, and now after knight b6, the best retreat here is simply bishop to d3. Part of the point here is actually the bishop can be quite well placed on this diagonal in some cases. So after knight to c6 to attack the pawn on d4, I can simply defend with the bishop, which is nice. It's nice to play bishop e3 because the bishop is secure here, and also we don't have to worry about knight e2, bishop to g4. So if black tries to blockade this way, I can go bishop e4. If f5, challenging my bishop on e4, I would like to keep it there, so I'll take en passant. I'll play takes, knight c3, bishop f3. But here, part of the problem here is that Well, black is not so solid now because some squares have been weakened in the process of challenging that e4 bishop. So if I just go bishop to d2, bishop e6, knight to h3, white is actually objectively slightly better here. White gets a pretty good isolated queen pawn position here because there are also some weak squares and black's king is not so secure. But the knight f6 line has been played by many grandmasters and is definitely a very serious line. But what white should do is gain space and then play bishop to e3 and then simply try to challenge black's pieces in the center. Another idea after the move e4 is the move b5. And you might be wondering, how do I regain my pawn here? Which is a very, very important question. So I play the move a4. So notice that if the move a6 is played, again, I can exploit the fact that the rook is undefended. So they play c6, and now I play takes, takes. So here I have the nice move knight to c3. And now what I'm doing is I'm simply attacking the b5 pawn. And it's really not easy for black to defend here. So that's part of the problem here. So in this position, actually bishop d7 has been played a few times. I like the move d5. I think that's a nice move. And part of the point here is notice that what this d5 move did, now the knight on b8 is not able to come out. And black also has the problem with, well, what do I do with my other pieces on the king side too? So that's the issue. So actually here, while we are temporarily down a pawn, the big problem for black is that he just can't get his pieces out. So this sacrifice is very worthwhile for white. So after a6, this is a move that's been played recently in some grandmaster games. And here a nice idea for white is simply to take the pawn. They take back, so black sacrifices the exchange. Bishop b7, and the idea is that black wants to get immediate counterplay with ideas like bishop b4 check and attacking the e4 pawn. But with white, I can actually just play knight e2 and then play b3, and I'm really trying to undermine the pawns here. So for instance, if bishop d3, trying to play as actively as possible with black's bishop, I can just take, and play rook to a8. So if knight f6, I can just play this way. And if we look at the material here, white is up the exchange at the cost of a pawn, but there's insufficient compensation here for black. So this is definitely going to be better for white. So unfortunately for black, the move b5 simply does not cut it. In this key variation with a6, black doesn't get enough compensation for the exchange. So another key move to look at is what happens if c5. The important point here is that white should gain space, take the space, and so after knight to f6, we can simply go knight to c3. And after e6, we can simply play bishop takes c4. And now there's a very nice point here. So if e takes d5, I don't like to take with the e pawn, because the problem is if we take here a6, a4, bishop d6, the problem here is, yes, we do have a passed pawn, but it's actually blockaded pretty reasonably by that bishop on d6, which is not easy to undermine because the knight is not able to hop in order to attack it. So black is usually very, very solid in that case. So what we want to do is we want to take with the knight. And the point here is that the e4 pawn is not undefended because here I can play the move queen to e2, which will win a piece. So because knight takes e4 cannot be played, black will usually take on d5, but then look at how I'm able to utilize the d5 square. My bishop is an excellent piece. So here I can just play knight to e2, and now the knight can also support the d5 square or occupy the d5 square later. For instance, castle, castle, knight a6, trying to go knight to b4 to challenge the bishop on d5. I can play bishop f4 and simply knight to c3. Bishop f6, and I simply like the move queen to f3. And here I had the idea of going queen to g3. And after takes, 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 the problem for black is that there's the threat of playing bishop to h6 if queen takes d5 is played. Otherwise, white can simply go c4 and has a protected passed pawn on d5 and a definite advantage. So it's very important to understand what is white trying to do in all of these cases where the pawns are attacked. because white does have this ideal pawn center. Probably the most challenging move, and this is the main line. The overwhelming main line is e5. And the point, you might be wondering, am I not just losing a pawn on e5? Well, notice this. D takes e5, queen takes d1, king takes d1, white cannot castle now. And after knight c6, attacking the e5 pawn, knight to f3, defending the pawn, there's simply bishop g4. And again, the pawn is very hard to defend, and because the pawn isn't able to be effectively defended, black gets excellent counterplay and a nice lead in development. So the best move is for white to play knight f3 and for white to actually sacrifice the pawn here. So after e takes d4, we simply play bishop takes c4. I want to point out one thing. So if black plays bishop e4 check, you might be wondering, how do I make sure I can maintain the ability to regain that c4 pawn? Well, white can play knight c3 now. So if e takes d4, knight takes d4, knight d7, here we have the simple move bishop takes c4. So here we have a slightly better pawn structure. We have the e4 pawn versus the c7 pawn in the center. White has a space advantage here, and if knight to f6, we can play the simple move f3. And here we simply just have a slightly better pawn structure. So bishop b4 check doesn't quite cut it. And after e takes d4, we can simply go bishop takes c4. So we have a lead in development. We have two pieces out. We're attacking the d4 pawn. We want to castle quickly. And if we can just get our development completed quickly, black's going to be in some trouble. I want to point out one idea here. If black plays bishop b4 check here, we simply go knight d2. And the idea is that we want to castle and attack that d4 pawn. So if knight c6, castle, you still might be a little nervous. You might be going, uh-oh, I'm down a pawn. I need to make sure I can gain it back. So let's look at this. Knight f6, the most natural way to develop. We play e5, attacking the knight. The knight moves away to d5. And here we get to go knight to b3. So now the pawn cannot be defended. So after knight to b6, we can just play bishop b5. And if queen d5, attacking that bishop, I can play bishop takes, queen takes, knight takes, queen to d5, and I can simply go queen to e2. And here white again has a pretty nice lead in development, well-placed pieces. Black's pieces look a little clumsy. Let's say if bishop g4, I simply like the idea of playing rook to d1. And I also have some threats here, with the rook lined up with the queen. There are some definite threats. For instance, if takes, I take here, I'm threatening to go knight c2. So white definitely has an advantage in this case. So bishop b4 check makes sense, but in this case, black falls behind in development. So my idea was simply to go bishop takes c4, knight c6, and then to castle. And let's say black tries the natural idea of just holding on to the material. Bishop c5, just trying to hold on tight, trying to say, okay, well, I have the d4 pawn, what do you have? Well, we have the move queen to b3. This is an important move. We're attacking f7. So they really need to be careful with how they defend. Notice they can't go knight h6 because we can always just take with the bishop. So queen f6 is the most natural move to defend the f7 pawn. But look at what we get to do here. We get to go bishop g5, attacking the queen with tempo. And now I simply go knight bd2, knight e7, and rook ac1. And look at my pieces here. My pieces are really superb. Notice c7 is undefended. Black definitely has some difficulty here with his pieces. The bishop on c5 is undefended as well. So black plays bishop b4 and white plays a3. And in general, this is how the play develops. White has the bishop pair here. And, after castling, we can simply play the move bishop d3. And part of the problem here for black is, what does he do with these pieces? The knights are tripping over each other, and these are sometimes called superfluous knights because they're trying to utilize the same squares. So the problem here for black is that it's just not easy to see how you're able to use those squares. So that's the fundamental problem that black experiences, that it's not easy to decide what to do with the bishop on c8. Notice the b7 pawn may be hanging if it develops. So the whole problem here for black is that there's basic trouble with development, and white's pieces are very well placed, and he has the bishop pair, which is generally worth about half a pawn. So the main move, rather than bishop c5, which causes black to be behind in development, is to play bishop e6. But here white has a way to fight for the initiative with bishop to b5, again, trying to regain the pawn. So black has to play bishop c5, and now we get to go b4, which is a nice space-gaining move that allows us to play bishop b2 to try to regain that pawn on d4. So after bishop to b6, we play a4. And after a6, now we take and play bishop to b2. So we're going to get the pawn back here. So after knight f6, I can play a5. So this may be of some concern to you, but notice that we get a very, very good pawn structure after bishop takes d4. So even though they can take our e4 pawn, let's play out a few moves. Takes. Black doesn't want to allow queen takes d8, so he takes, and knight to e5. So the c6 pawn is attacked. So here black plays bishop d5. So here I'll just go rook to e1. So I have some definite threats down the e file. So black counters those threats by castling, and now I can simply go f3. And if rook to e8, attacking my knight, I can play simply knight to d3. And after knight to d6, yes, I do admit that the position is quite simplified, but we still have an endgame with chances that are better for white. So white is the one with all of the winning chances here, even though white is temporarily down a pawn. Notice black has these three isolated pawns. It's just a bit difficult here. For instance, if knight f6, we can play the move rook to d1, and the threat is to play knight to e5. And in some cases, white has ideas like maybe knight a4, knight c5 as well. So a very, very interesting line, and one that indicates that it's not so easy in this line of the Queen's Gambit accepted. So I think that the important thing in this variation for most players is to, first of all, with white, understand how do I regain that pawn? Because the fundamental drawback to the Queen's Gambit accepted is that the whole reason why you play d5 is because white's threat is to play e4 and build up an ideal pawn center. So in chess, we never really want to give up that ideal pawn center. But in this case, black's idea is to play dynamically. So after the move e4, notice how all of the main moves here are either aimed at securing the pawn or are aimed at attacking the ideal pawn center d4, e4, and making the pawns advance. So that's an important strategic point. But notice how we're able to regain the pawn in all of these important lines, like specifically this line with e5, where temporarily we're down a pawn for quite some time. As you see, notice that in this line, like I was saying, we don't have to worry about the c4 pawn because we're able to recapture it so quickly. And it's important that we're not blocking anything, so we can just freely recapture the pawn on c4. So, these lines can be worth revisiting again and again because it is important to really understand why is white able to just play down a pawn. And so if you don't really understand why we're able to play down a pawn for a number of moves, it's going to be very difficult to confidently play this way with white. But as we saw in variations like this, we can regain our pawn quite simply by playing knight bd2 and knight b3, whereas in the main line we have our active idea of, yes, we are playing to sacrifice a pawn, but as you'll notice in the main line, white actually has a very good pawn structure. So even though, yes, we are down a pawn, we're the one who actually has the better chances. So we get a very nice little endgame to play here, and this nicely illustrates a sharp and dynamic way for white to play that doesn't quite aim for the usual kind of solid, isolated queen-pawn positions, and also doesn't aim for a rather dry endgame. It aims to really sharpen the play a bit more and put the pressure on black. And so whether you're playing d4 with white, or whether you're playing the Queen's Gambit accepted with black, or simply just curious about the strategy of this opening, e4 is the move that puts the most strategic pressure on black. So notice that if you want to play this variation with black, you have to have some good ideas for how you want to challenge the center, how you want to counter the e4 plan, and how you want to try to equalize here. Very sharp lines, a lot of different nice strategic ideas for both sides. So hopefully this has been useful for you. This is International Master Eric Kislik. Thanks.